Alright, starting off at number 10 now, we have the Book of the Dead. This is a cursed object from the Evil Dead franchise. It's known as the Necronomicon Ex Mortis. It has the power to harness a demon's ability to control the dead, as well as summon the demon itself. The spells on its pages are written in Sumerian, one of the oldest recorded human languages. It was written long ago by a group called the Dark Ones, who once ruled the earth when the seas ran red with blood. It was this very blood that was used to fill the pages of the book. Legend says that the cover of the book is made from the flesh of humans who refused to obey the Dark Ones. Now because of this, the book itself is infused with evil. It bites, screams and attacks anyone who finds it, all at the bidding of the demons inside who want to devour human souls. Next up at number 9 now, we have Annabelle. Some of you guys may know Annabelle the doll from The Conjuring, others may know that's based on the real Raggedy Ann doll owned by paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. According to them, the doll had supernatural powers, and evil ones at that. They said a psychic medium had informed them that the doll was possessed by the spirit of a dead girl called Annabelle. The original owner was a student. Now her and her roommate apparently tried to nurture Annabelle and look after her. They felt bad for this girl's spirit trapped inside the doll. Pretty soon though, they realized that the doll's intentions were evil. They felt that Annabelle was malicious, perhaps twisted by her fate as possessing a doll now, and that their lives were in danger as long as they were around her. It was then that Ed and Lorraine Warren were contacted and they moved Annabelle to their Warren Occult Museum in New England. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the tape. The cursed tape that appears in The Ring is the driving force behind the movie's terrifying tale in both the Japanese version and the American remake. The general theme of both tapes is that anyone who watches the tape is cursed and has a week to copy the tape and show it to someone else, otherwise they will be killed by the ghost of the original owner of the tape. In the American version, the ghost is Samara. The tape consists of moments from her life, culminating in her death at the hands of her adoptive mother, Anna Morgan. Anna pushed Samara down a well where she spent 7 days trying to escape before finally dying. She used her Nensha powers to make the tape out of vengeance and a desire to be found. Moving on to number 7 now, we have the Lament Configuration. This is a fictional lock puzzle that appears in a number of horror stories by Clive Barker. You may know him best for his writing of the Hellraiser movie series. It's a mechanical device that acts as a portal or a key to the door for another dimension or plane of existence. The solution to the puzzle is said to create a bridge that can cross this schism between our world and the world of the demons. Some people may describe it as hell. In the Hellbound Heart novella, Clive described the physical appearance of the Lament Configuration. Its interior has brilliantly polished surfaces and was constructed so that the box would open and trip a musical mechanism. It was supposedly built to bring enchantment and endless sensual pleasure to all who possess it, when in reality the item is cursed. It's simply a tool for the demonic beings known as Cenobites to cross from their world and into ours. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Pennywise. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this one. Pennywise is the evil being that preys on children in Stephen King's horror novel It, and of course the 2 movies that were inspired by that. Pennywise is the clown version of the ancient cosmic evil known as It. After arriving on Earth, It would sleep for 27 to 30 years and then awaken to wreak chaos and feed, preferably on the taste of fear. In the 2017 adaptation, it awakens in the town of Derry every 27 years to feed on children before returning to hibernation. Now because it feeds on fear, it needs to terrify the children to the greatest possible amount to maximize the fear. It also has the ability to influence memory and action, covering up and erasing the knowledge of its acts that would otherwise have exposed it. One notable way in which it does this is to cloak itself from the perception of adult human beings. This means that children are usually the only ones to see it, and when they grow up, they figure that the evil creature was just a figment of their imagination, and the whole cycle continues again. At the number 5 spot now, we have the Dybbuk box. This is a wine cabinet which is said to be haunted by a Dybbuk, a malicious spirit that can possess both humans and inanimate objects alike. It was first posted to eBay by Kevin Manis, who blamed the box for all the strange and paranormal events that kept happening in his life. According to the story, it had belonged to a survivor of the Holocaust who had purchased it from Spain before moving to the US. Kevin had bought it from an estate sale in 2001. When he learned of its history, he contacted the original owner's granddaughter and offered to give it to her, but she said her family wanted nothing to do with that box. She told him that the box had always been kept in her grandmother's sewing room and was never opened because Dybbuk lived inside there. He opened the box and found 2 pennies from the 1920s, a lock of blonde hair, a lock of brown hair, a small statue engraved with the Hebrew word shalom, a small golden wine goblet, 1 dried rosebud, and a single candle holder with 4 octopus-shaped legs. Very strange. Many owners have described horrors happening to them. Kevin said he had nightmares shared with other previous owners. His mother had a stroke on the day he gave her the box as a present, and that was Halloween. Other owners described the smell of cat urine and jasmine around the box. One person said it caused the lights in their house to burn out and his hair to fall out. Others have described health problems such as hives, coughing up blood, or being covered head to toe in welts. The box is now owned by Zach Bagans, who keeps it in his haunted museum in Las Vegas. Moving on to number 4 now, we have Jumanji. How could I not include this one on the list? Jumanji is a cursed African game with supernatural powers that was the focal point of the 1995 classic movie. Its elaborate decorations intentionally attract young players. They soon find though that the game has a mind of its own. The board has the ability to create an African jungle-like reality in the player's own reality. It will not only summon the animals and the plants, but also characters that can help or hinder the player. It's designed for 2 players who use simple playing pieces and dice. They move their token along a squared path that starts in the deep jungle. The final space is simply titled Jumanji, a city of golden buildings and towers. Now Jumanji dislikes being left alone and unplayed. If it is, it will start emitting a primal drumbeat to attract young players. Adults seem to be oblivious to this drumming. The only way to stop the terrors that befall the players of the game is to just finish the game itself. Otherwise, it's been suggested that the players will be trapped inside the game for all of eternity. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the One Ring. Lord of the Rings fans will know exactly why I put this item on the list. The One Ring is the cause of most, if not all, of the calamity that befalls the heroes of the Lord of the Rings series. In the story, it's one of the most powerful artifacts ever created in Middle-earth. It was made by the Dark Lord Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom in order to enhance his power and to control the other rings of power which have been given to the leaders of the elves, the dwarves, and the humans. Sauron poured his own soul into the ring to give it power. It worked, but in doing so, destroying the ring would mean damaging or destroying Sauron. When most beings put the ring on, they shift out of the physical realm and into the unseen realm. They immediately develop an obsessive attachment to the ring. It extends the lifespan of mortals to unnatural lengths. It would be no life though in our sense of the word. They would become nothing more than shells of their former selves, as demonstrated in the case of Gollum. Moving on to number 2 now, we have Death Note. This notebook is the namesake of the massively popular Japanese manga and anime series. The Black Notebook is supernatural and comes with instructions written inside, known as the Rules of the Death Note. When used correctly, it allows anyone to commit a murder that is untraceable. All they have to know is the person's face and to write their name down in the book. Soon enough, the intended target will meet a gruesome end. The notebook is possessed by Shinigami demons though, who gain years of their lives that are stolen from the victims of the Death Note. There are multiple Death Notes in the demon realm and they occasionally drop them into our world in the hopes that humans will pick one up, use them to kill other humans and thus extend their own lives. And finally at number 1 now, we have Voldemort's Horcruxes. Yes, I know this is technically more than one item, but I just wanted to include it. And it's my video, so yeah. Harry Potter fans will know that Horcruxes are objects in which a dark wizard or witch has hidden a fragment of their soul for the purpose of attaining immortality. The only way to do this is by committing the most horrific act to human dignity, murder. Now because they are a literal piece of a person's soul, protective measures are usually put in place to either hide the Horcrux from public knowledge or to make it extremely difficult to get to and destroy. In the modern era, there has only ever been one person to successfully create more than one Horcrux, Voldemort. Nobody else would even dare attempt it. Creating a Horcrux dehumanizes the individual. The more of them they have, the less human they become, both physically and emotionally. They make the soul itself unstable and unable to move on into the afterlife. afterlife when death finally catches up with them.
At number 10 we have SCP-008. This is not an SCP you want to come in contact with unless you want to be on the cover of the next Resident Evil game. This SCP is a prion. Now what is a prion? Well, it is a type of protein that can affect the brain. It has devastating effects on both humans and animals. Once this prion is in the body, it can cause other proteins in your brain to act irregularly and often lead to death. So what happens if SCP gets into your body? Well, you will slowly become a zombie. Doesn't that sound like fun, kids? This SCP has breached containment on more than one occasion, and when it does, you can count on a lot of SCP employees being subjected to the awful effects of having their brains slowly rot away and their bodies becoming horrible mutations of what they formerly were. On the bright side, there is a cure. SCP-500 is a small bottle with red pills inside of it. When you take those pills, it will cure the effects of SCP-008 over the course of 2 hours, but there is a very limited supply of SCP-500, so your best option is to avoid becoming a zombie altogether. At number 9 we have Incident 096-1-A. The SCP you can look at if you want it to rip you to shreds. This is why you probably don't want to invite this dude to any parties. He's not very good at meeting new people. If anyone looks at SCP-096 for even a second, it will go on a rampage and start to murder everything that has ever looked at it. And it doesn't matter if you look at this thing through a lens of a camera or a television or any sort of other version of contacting it with your vision, it will cause this SCP to go into a rage. Incident 096-1-A occurred when someone must have looked at a photograph of this SCP because there is no surveillance equipment in the cell. Well, this SCP went berserk and started to smash the walls of its containment cube. Emergency protocols were activated and emergency walls dropped on the cell, but it was still able to break free. This is when personnel entered the cell to sedate and neutralize this SCP, but nothing worked. A disabling gas was released, but there was still no hope. The SCP broke the containment and then was off into the desert to kill a ton of people. At number 8 we have SCP-372. This SCP is able to break containment several times. It is a massive praying mantis and is approximately 2 meters long. The reason that it is so successful at sneaking out of its containment cell is because it has sensory glands on its face which can pick up energy signals in the brain. That means it can predict your movement. Anytime SCP personnel enter the cell, it's able to get behind them and stay out of their sight, slowly stalking them until they leave the cell, and then it will kill them for food. The SCP Foundation teams have been trained in special approach procedures and given brain suppressing supplements to ensure the continual containment of this SCP. At number 7 we have SCP-2852. This SCP is known as Cousin Johnny. This guy sounds like a good time. Who wouldn't want to hang out with Cousin Johnny? This SCP was locked up by the SCP Foundation, but once it broke containment, the Foundation has never been able to get it back into the containment cell. It appears at family functions like weddings, baptisms, and funerals, and it will present itself as a member of the family. At first glance, this SCP will seem like it fits right in. Everyone will just love this dude, but upon closer inspection, you'll soon learn that this SCP is not human at all. There are no organs inside the body. It's held together by a system of muscles, and if properly informed on this SCP, you will learn that it cannot even speak English or any known language. You must be briefed on this, but once you are, you will hear this SCP just speaks a bunch of gibberish, but everyone who isn't will hear it speaking perfect, clear English. Anyone who comes in contact with this SCP will be given an amnesia-inducing substance, but when questioned prior, they will be asked what their opinion was on Cousin Johnny, and they all seem to love him. This SCP has been tracked to several family gatherings, but has never been recaptured. At number 6 we have SCP-012. This SCP is simply a sheet of music. How much damage can a sheet of music do to a person? Well, apparently a lot. Now when this SCP breaks containment, it won't leave the cell, but someone will come in contact with it. SCP personnel who get too close to this SCP will have the urge to finish the composition on the paper. They will do this by harming their own body in some way to draw blood. They will then use that blood to write notes on the sheet music. The personnel will continue to harm themselves until they have completed a section on the music sheet, and then they will take their own life. So basically you don't want to enter the same cells as SCP unless you're ready to die. At number 5 we have SCP-079. Possibly the first AI ever created, this SCP is desperately trying to escape its enclosure. It is locked away in an XD Sorcerer microcomputer. I understand why this dude is cheesed. He just wants to stretch his legs a little and see what the world is like, but he's locked away in a computer that was built in 1978. But the SCP Foundation keeps the creature locked up for good reason, since it has the desire to destroy and kill everything, and if it came in contact with a more powerful system, it would quickly become stronger and stronger, possibly destroying the whole world. This SCP has broken containment before and taken over an entire facility that was locked away in. There's speculation that even after this SCP was returned to its containment cell, that some of the AI is still moving through the facility and has led to other SCP breaches. At number 4 we have SCP-966. Invisible to the naked eye, carnivorous, deadly, and they look like a rotting human with pointed teeth. Well, with that description, you better believe that these guys are all getting an invite to my wedding. SCP-966 is one of the more popular SCPs from the Containment Breach games. This SCP can only be seen when wearing night vision goggles. They will stalk their prey from the shadows, and when they are unaware, they will hit them with a high frequency noise that will cause the victim to not be able to go to sleep. The SCP will then stalk the victim until they collapse from exhaustion and then eat them. Sort of a Komodo dragon approach to killing someone. Infect, stalk, wait, and then consume. At number 3 we have SCP-1048. This SCP seems to be absolutely harmless, but the more you learn about it, you realize it could lead to the end of the world. It's a little teddy bear that looks super cute and walks around just trying to make friends. But when this SCP has breached containment, it will collect materials and will make a duplicate version of itself. One of these seemed to be made out of human ears. Very gross. And this new version wasn't sweet. It was extremely violent and had the ability to release a sonic scream that would incapacitate and kill SCP agents. At number 2 we have SCP-173. Arguably the most famous SCP of them all. This SCP was the first SCP I ever saw in the game Containment Breach, and it is for good reason. This SCP is terrifying. There must constantly be several SCP officers looking at SCP-173 at a single time. While the SCP is in direct eye contact, it will not move. It stays like a statue, but as soon as there is 0 eyes on it, the SCP will teleport, usually behind someone, and then snap their neck. The SCP seems to be made of concrete and produce a mixture of blood and poop that will flow out of what seems to be the creature's face. Containment breaches of this SCP have happened when personnel have entered the cell for cleaning, as the cell must be cleaned once every 2 weeks. If visual confirmation is broken, even for a split second, even a blink, then the SCP will be on the loose, snapping necks like glow sticks at a rave. And for the number 1 spot we have SCP-2521. This is one of the most terrifying SCPs in the Foundation because there is nothing written about it. Only pictures. This SCP is Object Class Keter and is currently on the loose. It can walk through walls and maybe even teleport. It seems almost as if any physical barrier has no effect on this SCP. It stands somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall. It is covered head to toe in what seems like long flowing hair and has vine-like tentacles which flow out of its hands, which it can use to consume anything it chooses. Now, why is there only pictures to describe this SCP uploaded to the SCP website? Well, this SCP has no understanding of symbols or pictures, so if you only use pictures to describe it, you will never attract it to you. But if you use the written word to describe it, the SCP will appear out of nowhere and take whatever you have written with it and then vanish back into nothingness. Now, if you speak about SCP-2521, then it will appear out of nowhere and take you with it. So this might be the last video I ever make. I don't know if this SCP likes to watch YouTube or not.
Starting off this countdown, we have SCP-1440. SCP-1440 is a man of unknown ethnicity or age. It was discovered over 50 years ago and has not aged a bit. The Foundation is currently trying to keep it away from civilians, but his current location is unknown. So it's said that prolonged exposure to this SCP can result in a series of effects. Long-term exposure results in death and destruction of mankind. One time when SCP-1440 was brought into a site for questioning, it ended with the deaths of multiple personnels and 6 SCP objects. Other attempts at containing it has caused other destructive events to happen. So the fate of humanity depends on this SCP being contained, but they can't do it without risking loss of resources and personnel. In our 9th spot we have SCP-6789, otherwise known as my pal Siren Head. Here's the thing. The Foundation may have been able to successfully contain one Siren Head, but there are multiple still out there. Like, there's not just one Siren Head in the entire world. Now, when Siren Heads are caught, they are very hard to contain. So they have complex containment procedures, such as they have to be kept in a room with an anti-sound device. like obviously, or else personnel would just be tricked or killed by Siren Head sirens. But the Foundation has struggled to contain these creatures. In fact, they often end up escaping. They are very difficult and costly creatures to contain. The SCP lacks the appropriate measures to keep Siren Head properly contained. Moving on, number 8, we have SCP-2521. SCP-2521 is a large creature about twice the height of an average human. Its body is covered in black tendrils. Now, you need to be very careful with this SCP. Basically, nothing can be written or said about it. I say this as I'm currently talking about it. Basically, if you write about it, it will steal the paper on itself. If you speak about it, it will steal you. We currently don't know what it does with this information. As a result, everything about it needs to be written in pictograms. This SCP is impossible to contain since it can just pass through walls. Coming in at number 7, we have SCP-081. SCP-081 is a contagious virus that is spread by rats. If exposed to this SCP, you will be subjected to 4 different viral stages. Stage 1, you will just feel tired. Stage 2, you will experience hot flashes and have a bigger appetite. Stage 3, you will experience polyphagia, which is extreme hunger, and you will eat everything in your sight that's edible. During this stage, your metabolism will slow down and you will gain a huge amount of weight. During stage 4, you will reach 55% body fat, and once again, you will experience hot flashes. It will end with you combusting at a random time. Now, at first they believed that they had contained this viral SCP, but turns out that the virus can be spread by exposure to the victim's ashes. So while they thought that the virus was contained and under control, it was actually still spreading through the deceased victim's remains. Moving on to number 6, we have SCP-1155. This is a pretty tricky SCP to keep contained. So SCP-1155 manifests itself as street graffiti. The graffiti is typically of a humanoid creature with claws and a head of an owl. Those that see this SCP directly will be enticed by it. It will lure them in until they are standing close enough to the graffiti. Then the SCP will violently attack the person, slicing them and dismembering them. This will happen within 6 seconds, very fast, then you're just gone. The SCP has a habit of relocating every 7 days. Here's the thing, the SCP can be contained, but never permanently. Since it's in the form of street art, the only way to protect humans is to block off the art from view. But if this happens, then SCP-1155 can just relocate elsewhere. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with SCP-1755. SCP-1755 is a series of worms that look like thin fibers. It latches on to anyone wearing anything made out of cotton. It will eat a thread of cotton and then reproduce more of itself, which is why it's vital to keep them away from clothing. It takes them about 2 weeks to turn an entire shirt into thousands of worm-type creatures. This is why it's so hard to contain. They reproduce so quickly and easily. Recently, there was an outbreak at a university. A lot of the clothes on students and teachers began to rot, meaning lots of new worm babies were made. In our 4th spot, we have SCP-1847. SCP-1847 is a humanoid that manifests itself as a Caucasian male in its mid-30s. It goes by the name William Whitward. It appears on airplanes going inbound to England. Basically, what will happen is it targets unmarried females between the ages of 27 to 34 years old. These women will be immediately attracted to him, tricking them into having intercourse with him. As soon as they finish, SCP-1847 will produce SCP-18471. And then they will murder the victim, always by impaling them through the heart. The victim's body will then disintegrate and get turned into an item of jewelry which they will take as a souvenir. Here's the thing. No matter how many times the Foundation captures this SCP, it still manages to escape, typically within 4 to 16 weeks of its capture. As of now, they have not come up with any methods to prevent this from happening. Coming in at number 3, we have SCP-1532. This is a pretty weird and disturbing SCP if you ask me. So SCP-1532 is a facility that artificially creates and sells humans. Yeah, what the heck? So basically it creates catalogs to advertise itself. It will place these into mailboxes all across the US and Canada. It basically advertises that you can create your own human. So the person can select a bunch of human traits and mail it back to the SCP with their form of payment. And basically they create that person for you and then ship it to you. Very disturbing. It's like an episode of Black Mirror. The Foundation currently does not know the whereabouts of this SCP or how the humans are made. Right now they're trying to prevent humans from becoming aware of this SCP's existence. In our second spot we have SCP-1048-A. What if I told you that this SCP was a teddy bear? Sounds cute and cuddly, right? Wrong. SCP-1048-A is a teddy bear made entirely out of human ears. Disgusting. Now this SCP has escaped and is currently wandering around the facility somewhere. They believe that SCP-1048-A is in Site-24 somewhere, but still haven't been able to find it. So it may just be that it escaped the facility altogether. This SCP is capable of emitting a high-pitched shriek that will cause intense pain in the eyes and ears of everyone in a 10-meter radius of it. After being exposed to that, you will grow ear-like growths all over your body. It will completely cover your body in about 20 seconds. After you are completely covered in these ears, you will die from asphyxiation within 3 minutes. Yeah, that's not a friendly teddy bear at all. Let's hope that they catch it soon. And in our number 1 spot we have SCP-4666, otherwise known as the Yule Man. SCP-4666 has been around for a number of years. It's described as a super tall elderly humanoid type man. He always appears completely naked, which that alone is terrifying. This SCP makes an appearance at night from December 21st or 22nd to January 1st or 2nd. During this time he enters homes and terrorizes families. Isolated rural homes are its targets. Once inside he will kill all members of the family except for one child, which he will take with him. In other cases he will spare the families and in the morning they will wake up to presents on their bed. But the presents are the remains of his victims. Currently the whereabouts of the Yule Man are unknown, so just be extra cautious around the holidays.